Thank you, Dr. McFate, for joining us. Could you please share a bit about your background? It's a pretty traditional background, Brown, 82nd, contractor, and love to discuss the difference between contractor or mercenary, ran Georgetown National Defense University. So very traditional background, but very untraditional book. So it'd be great to hear from you, your background.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, the book is untraditional, which we'll talk about, but my background on paper looks traditional, but I went from, I grew up as a violinist in New York City. I was 9 years old, and I went to like this boarding school that was like a feeder school for Juilliard, and my dream at age 9 was to play Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in Carnegie Hall at age 17. And then at 13, I had my first midlife crisis. And but I went from violin to Brown, which is a very liberal school. But I went from Brown to the 82nd Airborne Division, which is a very non-liberal place, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And then from there, I went from the 82nd to Amnesty International, and then from Amnesty International to DynCorp International, which is like Blackwater. And so I keep on going from different group to different group. As a kid, I'll say that one of my favorite books as a kid was called The Once and Future King by White. And it tells a story of King Arthur. And King Arthur, as a boy, his education comes from Merlin. But Merlin, what he does is he turns like, if Arthur's lesson is to learn about how teamwork, how that works, he turns Arthur into an ant. And Arthur's got to be an ant for like a week. And then he learns about getting along in a team and different animals, different experiences. So that my background actually, on paper, looks traditional, but actually it's a little bit like King Arthur's.
And so fast forward to today, you're teaching at Georgetown and you're teaching at National Defense University. Can you share what you teach?
Sure. So today I'm on faculty at the National Defense University, which for those who don't know, it's like the premier war college for the Department of Defense. It's located in Washington. Students there are lieutenant colonels who are going to become colonels. This is senior ranking officers from across the services. Many of them are going to be, flag officers. And also about half of our student body is international. So, Jordan, Guatemala, Pakistan, they'll all send their very best to the United States. And they will someday become defense chiefs. And that's one set of students. Then at Georgetown, I have super smart, precocious 25-year-olds who do all the reading and ask hard questions about the reading. But both of these are fantastic experiences. I learn as much from the students as I do teaching them.
Great. Can you share a bit about your book and the goal of your book? So I've read the book. I've read about the 10 lessons, and very untraditional, right?
It is, yeah.
And let's just start with the future of war is not conventional.
Right. So this book, first of all, I wrote it so that my mother could read it. This is not like an academic tome. It's not like a wonky DC thing. It is not a inside the beltway only jargon. It is written so that everybody can read it, because I think strongly that we need a national conversation about the direction our country is taking when it comes to war. And, why have we stopped winning wars is really the question. I wrote this book because I was angry, frankly. I know you have lost friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen the U.S. spend trillions of dollars in foreign seas overbroad. We've tarnished our national honor by not winning. Meanwhile, we've only made situations worse on the ground. I mean, Iraq was much safer under Saddam Hussein than under the United States of America. We have to ask ourselves why, right? We have the best troops. We have the best training, the best equipment, the best technology, the most money. So what's the problem? That was the puzzle I was trying to answer with this book. And the answer is, I answer that question, what the problem? The problem is something I call strategic atrophy. It's basically that we have the best military, but we don't have the best strategists who can deploy it. And it's not just the military, it's all of government. The way we do foreign engagement we frankly we have a low strategic IQ, and we need to raise it. And so what I've done in this book is propose 10 new rules of modern warfare. Now, these rules will make the traditional warrior's head explode. I've already gotten some exploding heads in the Pentagon, and that's okay. That's okay. Because usually, for a country to change its way of warfare usually requires a lot of blood. Think of Verdun, think of the Somme, right, 100 years ago.
Kasserine Pass,
Exactly.
Task Force Smith.
And even then, countries don't change their way of war. So I am trying to raise the ante, if you will, to promote a larger discussion so that people don't think that we are condemned to forever wars.
So some point blank questions. Iraq, Afghanistan, do we lose those wars?
We lost those wars.
And strategic atrophy or strategic atrophy plus lack of civil military connection?
All the above. I mean, when I say strategic atrophy, what I really mean is, strategic thought is not just it's not just a military thing. I mean, some of the most brilliant strategic thinkers are like Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, David Ben-Gurion. These are strategic thinkers, and they realize that Billy Mitchell, we'll talk about him. But they understand that there's more to war than warfare, and there's more to warfare than killing. What war is, it's armed politics, and we are good at winning the armed bit, but we're terrible at the politics. And this is what we had in the Vietnam War, and it'll be familiar to our own generation, that you can win every battle but yet lose the war. That's what armed politics means. To be at the strategic level of war, military victories have to transmute into political ones and vice versa. Our enemies know this, and that's why we're being, frankly, exploited. And that's one of the lessons of this book, is that we have to think beyond the military realm to win wars. War is much bigger than just the military.
So having read the book, I feel like this could have been authored by Putin or Xi Jinping. And it's like, here's how I would fight against the United States.
Right. Well, I do read and study what our adversaries are doing, and not just them, but others as well, because why would you not? Right? I mean, that's the problem. We have in some ways, a solipsistic national security establishment that likes to talk to itself. It swaps confirmation bias, and then they wonder why there's no WMD in Iraq.
What would you ask the Pentagon, the military, the Secretary of Defense to do differently to fix this? That's
a lot. So in this book, This book proposes problems. It has 10 rules, the first 4 of which are things that we have to stop doing. Think of them as bad habits. And then rules 5 through 10 are new things you have to sort of develop. And a lot of the rules have prescriptions. Some of the prescriptions could be fleshed out more. I ran out of time and space. But sometimes people ask me, well, if you were Secretary of Defense, SecDef, what would you do? And the first thing I would do is I would slash the Department of Defense budget. I would slash it. The reason I would slash it, well, one is because, like I said, war is more than warfare.
I can see why people in the Pentagon would not be happy.
So Lockheed doesn't like me. I'm okay with that. But
I think people in San Francisco would agree with you.
Probably, yeah. I think technology is important, but I think we invest in the wrong thing. So some of the big ticket items, the first rule of this, and we can talk about this in more detail, is conventional war is dead. And so what that means is the way we think about war and warfare is like World War II. We can save this, but most of the most expensive weapon systems are conventional war weapon systems. So you have to put the Pentagon on a diet for them to cut it.
You want to talk about the J-35? I think it's emblematic.
Sure. Yeah, so the second rule of this, and this is why Lockheed will never promote me to become, but hey,
truth to power, right?
Truth to power. So many of us question the current, I should be careful what I say, but the current interim Secretary of Defense is a Boeing guy. And he's a pure Boeing guy, Shanahan, and he might be very good.
No military background.
He is pure Boeing. His whole job is mostly selling Boeing equipment to the Pentagon since the 80s. And now he's in charge of the customer. Eisenhower would be spinning in his grave right now, as would John McCain. And, we'll see if he's acting or interim. These things tend to play out different ways. But, there's something a little off about this, I would say. I think the famous, there's many things we can talk about, but the F-35 is my favorite. So this is a fighter jet. If people have heard the F-35. This is a fighter jet that we have spent $1.5 trillion on. Okay, that is more than Russia's GDP. Okay, if this airplane were a country, it would rank in the top 10 or 20 countries in the world for GDP. In 2 long wars, it has flown exactly 0 combat missions. 0. And the measure of any weapon is its utility, right? And we're buying more of them. Why? Now, the Pentagon or Lockheed or who, I don't know who, it's like who is who, I don't know at this point sometimes, but they're like, no, we've flown a combat mission. So in October, they started, because they're tired of people like myself saying 0 combat missions, 17 years of war. And they say, well, no, so they're flying them in Afghanistan, and they're saying it's combat. But let me tell you, as a professor of strategy, it's not combat if the enemy can't shoot back, right? They're blowing up like, Jeeps in the desert. Meanwhile, if one of those things goes down, then we're in real trouble. And the thing costs $45,000 an hour to fly. That's like more than the mechanic repairing its salary, right? So such is our addiction to these conventional, and it's not just the F-35, it's everything. We're buying carriers, Ford-class carriers. They cost $13 billion a copy. That's before you add sailors and aircraft. We're sending them to the South China Sea using our old rules of war. This is the new rules. Old rules of war. It's the Cold War that will surely deter China. Guess what? It's not. It's not. But that doesn't stop us from sending more and more. And the reason is because there's a saying that generals always fight the last war. You've heard this? Actually really means is generals always fight the last successful war. And this truism happens to be true. And what that war is for us is World War II. The last time we achieved
the greatest generation.
The greatest generation, exactly.
They won't let us forget that.
No, they won't. And they have done great things. But the last time that we won a war decisively, the world ran in vacuum tubes, right? That is still, though, our paradigm of what warfare is. And when you ask people in Washington, D.C., what is the future of war, and people throw lots of money at this question, it's some version of World War II with better technology. So what the Pentagon is getting ready for is the Battle of Midway in the South China Sea with expensive aircraft carriers and F-35s, but that's not how it's going to go down.
And that's not how it went down in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes, they failed to cooperate with our strategy.
In regards to your book, you mentioned F-35, clearly a boondoggle of a project, and you mentioned some prescriptions like people over platforms.
Right. So we should invest in people over platforms, in gray matter over silicon. There was a time in the Navy when, so it might be the troops are definitely not the problem. We've just overstressed them. So you remember a couple years ago, we kept on having like our Navy destroyers running into freighters in the middle of the, how does that happen, right? And it's not like, we're talking ships at sea. These are not airplanes like bullets. These are, and one of the problems we have is that last year I was in sabbatical. I got to spend some time at Oxford, and I talked to some British Navy captains about this, and they were like, well, we train in seamanship first. All of our young officers, they have to be proven, seen before they do weapons and all. That's not what we do. We put not anymore. They've corrected us a little bit, but they threw the youngest, the ensigns and so forth onto the ship, and they didn't really train them. They just sort of threw them literally into the deep end, and they gave them a box of CDs, and they said, "This is your training course." And also, life on the ship. There's a saying. What's the difference between like the Navy and prison? You can't drown in prison. Life on a ship is hard. I mean, it's like 90, 100 hours a week. It's really hard at sea, and expecting these ensigns to like go home and go to their cabin and run these CD-ROMs as if that's a substitute for education. That's an example. So we need to invest in people and stop investing in technology. The technologies that we are investing in, I think there's some technologies we should invest in, but focusing on leadership and basic skills.
So we've spent trillions of dollars on boondoggle projects, and we also have spent probably billions to trillions of dollars on contractors. And you've written a fair bit about contractors,
right?
And would love your take on that.
So just so you know, I was a military contractor, but I wasn't just any military contractor. I was a trigger puller, which is different. So we can have a discussion about the pros and cons of public-private partnerships. We could have a discussion about what should be outsourced and what should not, going back to the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions. We can have a discussion about all those things. But the area that interests me most is the question of lethality. Because now the U.S. hires armed contractors to do paramilitary things. And there's a certain moral problem with that when you link profit motive to killing. There's also a question of, how do you control that? And does it spawn a larger market for force? And a market for force, think of the Italian Middle Ages when Machiavelli was writing. That's what a market for force looks like. When you have private armies and anybody who's rich enough can go to war for any reason they want, no matter how petty, then you have a lot of war. And also mercenaries do not like to work themselves out of work, out of a job. So mercenaries historically start and elongate wars for profit, or they act like Tony Soprano and engage in racketeering. There's lots of evidence for this. And this is the world that's starting to resurrect. Mercenaries went underground in the 1850s. Now they're coming back. We see mercenaries in Ukraine, Iraq, Yemen, Nigeria, Venezuela. So it's a story about Venezuela. So we all know Venezuela's imploding right now, right? It's on fire. We have Maduro. We have Guaido, and it's sort of a Cold War, almost ideological take. So Guaido is being supported by many Latin American countries, many EU countries, us. He's pro-democracy. Maduro, he's not, and he's being supported by China, Russia, and Turkey, right? That's not a surprise. What is surprising is that about a week and a half ago, a bunch of Russian mercenaries secretly showed up in Venezuela.
I feel like Venezuela is almost like the first test of the Monroe Doctrine.
It is. Well, in some ways, you're right, yeah. And maybe Nicaragua, but yeah. And this is an example of what modern war looks like, and this idea of durable disorder, which we'll get to. But these mercenaries showed up, and these mercenaries are they're not just Hollywood villains, and they're not just lone guys in the Congo jungle with Kalashnikovs. This is a group called the Wagner Group. Let me tell you about the Wagner Group. It's Russian-owned. They work for the GRU, which is their military intelligence. But they're mercenaries, so we don't know where they come from. They probably come from. I used to spend time in this industry. It's all they cluster around language groups. Okay, so the Russian, the ex-Soviet types, and a year ago, this group almost killed our most elite soldiers. So in February last year, we had a group of Delta, Rangers, Green Berets, and Marines with Kurds. I don't know if they're not the Peshmerga, but like Kurds in eastern Syria. And attacking them were 500 Wagner Group mercenaries. And they attacked them with tanks, T-72 tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers. And this is not the riffraff of ISIS. ISIS is amateur hour. This is like battle formations. And our most elite soldiers called in our most elite air aviation. F-15s, B-52s, AC-130s, Apache helicopters, drone ships. It took our best troops with our best aviation 4 hours to beat back 500 mercenaries. What happens when it's 5,000 mercenaries? Because that's the lesson Putin got. And even an undefeated army can lose. Now, we saw Putin deploy, or the Kremlin deploy these mercenaries into Ukraine to kneecap wayward Donbass battalion commanders. So as you know, the separatist movement in eastern Ukraine is largely manufactured by Russia. And militia commanders who are getting kind of weak, the Wagner Group, took them out. And that is maybe what's going on with the army in Venezuela, so it doesn't, go towards Guaido. They stick to Maduro, but that's speculative on my part.
So Russia in Venezuela, Russia in Crimea, Russia in Syria, who are America's greatest threats? Russia, China, Iran.
Yeah. So we could spend all night listing the greatest threats, right? The hit parade. Last year, the Pentagon shifted on this. They issued a new national defense strategy driven by General Mr. Mattis, who I personally have a great deal of respect for as a thinker. And it said we're gonna like lighten up on the counterterrorism. We're gonna lighten up the counterinsurgency, and we're gonna shift our focus to big adversary threats, like specifically China and Russia. Unfortunately, that guidance, I think, has been misconstrued. That a lot of people in the Pentagon, because they're old rule thinkers, think that if there's going to be a war with Russia and China, that it's going to be a conventional war. That's wrong. Why are we assuming that? In fact, I would argue that we may already be at war with Russia and China, and that part of their strategy is to keep us from thinking that we're at war. That is a strategy. And we can discuss that in further. But as bad as Russia and China are, as bad as ISIS is, or global warming, well, global warming is part of it, as bad as all these threats are, they're not the worst. The worst is systemic. The worst is something I call durable disorder. And these other threats are like incubating in it. And what durable disorder is, it's the retreat of the Westphalian order and what's left behind. So we all know the Westphalian order is like the sort of the nation state rule, and how strong it ever was is a question of debate amongst scholars. But I think we all can agree, with the exception of maybe a few, that it's in retreat. But the world is not completely anarchical. It's not like the sky is falling, let's invest in more sky. It is that other types of powers are replacing it. And that allows, this durable disorder is a system that can contain but not solve problems. And it's not new. This is what the world order has mostly been for most of history. I mean, we're just returning to the status quo ante of what happened before the Westphalian period. And this is the world of Machiavelli, it's the world of the Roman Empire, it's the world of everybody. We're just going back to that. And we have to, learn how to fight in that environment, because new environments create new types of warfare. That's what this book is really about. It's like, how do you fight in durable disorder? Because conventional war is the Westphalian way of warfare. Now we need a new way of warfare, and that's what I try to lay out and explain in the New Rules of War.
In the book and in your other writing, it feels like your answer to my last question would have been, it's actually us. We are perhaps our own worst enemy.
Well, there is that. So there is a pun on, we have seen the enemy and he is us, or they are us, or something. It's a pun on Commodore Perry. But we are struggling because of self-inflicted strategic wounds. So our adversaries have grasped durable disorder and exploit it. And we live in those who grasp it will prevail, and those who do not will be exploited. And I think, what Russia has done with our elections, as they have also done with the Brexit vote, as they've also done with, I think that is an example. What China is doing right now with the One Belt, One Road initiative, that's an example of these things. And we can go into details to how that is succeeding for them, but they are ahead of us. Our strategic thinking is ossified. and we need to catch up and surpass. Otherwise, we'll be speaking Mandarin someday.
Going back to the theme of perhaps we are our own worst enemies, I think of like Eric Prince. He's now in cahoots with China.
Yes.
I think potentially like our strongest assets, you mentioned this in our book, the economy and our technology companies, perhaps we're not leveraging it as much as we should. Thoughts on that?
That's a lot. Okay, so you've asked tough questions as always. I wanted easy questions. You asked tough questions. Eric Prince, we know Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater.
Prince of Darkness.
Prince of Darkness, as he's been called. Here's some things you may not know about him. He is right now pitching a plan to President Trump to replace all troops in Afghanistan and maybe Iraq and Syria too with mercenaries, probably his mercenaries. You say, well, that's crazy. We live in the era of President Trump. Did you know that Eric Prince's sister is Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education? Eric Prince, and I've talked to Eric Prince, we're kind of frenemies. He is pitching a simple solution to a complex problem based on price point. And you can imagine who that appeals to, right? And he is not giving up. Now, there's many problems with this, besides it being deeply un-American to replace American troops with mercenaries. But the other problem is he already has a boss. It's Beijing. He has a company that's owned by Beijing called Frontier Services Group, and they do stuff in Africa. They do stuff in Western China, and he's not relinquishing this. And his other interests are mining. And so what I think he wants to do is do mining in Afghanistan and truck it to market via China as part of the One Belt, One Road initiative and have taxpayers pay for that, as well as get us deeply embroiled with mercenaries in Afghanistan, which in my opinion is like throwing kerosene on a bonfire. So this is a very dangerous thing, but this is what we've come to, that mercenaries are now part of the international landscape and that he is one of the progenitors of it. And the fact that he is pitching this and he can maybe get an audience with the president says the kind of age that we're living in. We're living in an age of durable disorder, where mercenaries have always been a big part of war. In fact, mercenaries are the second oldest profession.
This age of disorder, I think a lot of people don't realize it's been happening for decades, because since 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq, in some cases, many years, the majority of forces on the ground were contractors.
Right.
I'm curious how you would delineate between contractors versus mercenaries.
So just clarity, I was a paratrooper. I got out and I became a private military contractor. Some would say mercenary. Now, I wrote a book on this called The Modern Mercenary. It's an academic book, Oxford University Press, that in an academic ease explains the differences, but it comes down to this. If you are an armed civilian doing paramilitary things in a foreign war, you're a mercenary. We don't have to get too cutesy with it. People like to say, no, you're a private security contractor, but the truth is, Blackwater is doing similar things to the Wagner Group and vice versa. We call one a mercenary, another a contractor. I think it's just all in the same orbit. So I think, and that's, but I also don't think all mercenaries are evil either, but we can discuss that. We can talk about why they're vilified, why the stigma exists.
So there are some great questions from the audience. One of them is the United States still required to be the world's policeman?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I think not. I would hope not. And also, most vets I talk to pray not. Most soldiers and like yourself, you take an oath to the United States of America, not to the world.
Yourself too.
And myself too. And I think it's also hubris to think that we can play God to this Garden of Eden called Earth. Now there are many who believe this. The neocons are one, like Bob Kagan and other, and he's still pushing this, right? And I think this is a problem because America is pursuing some regard a Humpty Dumpty policy of foreign affairs, where we're going to try to put back the liberal world order, the Westphalian order that we kind of held sway over in the 1980s or so. At least that's what the myth is. I think that's hubris. I think it's going to lead to danger, and we've already seen it destabilize Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the evidence is quite clear. The answer is no. We should not do that.
Are President Trump's policies contributing to durable disorder?
Yes, they are contributing to durable disorder.
Please expand.
Well, it's hard to analyze President
NATO, ceding ground to Russia.
Right. Well, we'll have to wait to see what Bob Mueller, who's a little bit like Elliot Ness, I must say. I met him, and he spoke at my Georgetown class. He was in between jobs. He was kind enough to come along, and he's a no-nonsense man. He's
an impressive individual.
Yeah,
he has a lot of San Francisco roots.
I did not know that. I know he was impressive. So we'll see what he has to say. But I do think that, look, as I say in the book, that durable disorder, those who grasp it will prevail, and those who don't will be exploited. And I think that we currently have a foreign policy that we are in the exploitation category, and we need to get savvy that because we think of war. Here's one of the problems. So one of the rules, there's 10 rules. One of the rules is that there's no such thing as war or peace. There's war and peace. Both coexist always. We think of war like pregnancy, right? You either are or you aren't. That's not how war works. And our adversaries like Russia and China exploit this for advantage. So let's take China. What they do in the South China Sea is they get right in between our space of war and peace. And they'll go up to they'll do things in the South China Sea. They'll go right to the brink of war, and then they stop. But they keep what they capture, or they keep what they create. And that's how they're winning the South China Sea, one island and one ally at a time. And we need to sort of understand that we may already be at war. Did you know that you cannot make... When was the last time anybody saw a bad movie about China made? When was the last time? Do you know why? They bought Hollywood. That is a very powerful soft power weapon. They can control their own narrative with the world's biggest megaphone. Right? Now, war and peace, right? We have to think about it's war and peace. To a lot of people in the Pentagon, that does not compute. But the truth is, think of the Cold War. We've done this before. We did it in the Cold War. So we need to think like the Cold War. Not that we're going back to a Cold War. I think that analogy is very harmful. But that international politics is more complicated than the black and white version of war and peace.
So you mentioned China has bought pieces of Hollywood. China invests a ton now in Silicon Valley. Clearly, China is buying up real estate, One Belt, One Road. Let me take a Bay Area perspective on this, which is this is making a bigger pie for everyone. This is good for China. This is good for the United States. Great for our economies. How would you delineate between this type of perspective and we are in a type of shadow war right now?
Yeah. So there was this idea in the 1990s that opening up economies would naturally democratize nations.
End of democracy or end of history.
Well, there's a Fukuyama approach, and let's not discuss Fukuyama. We can if you like, but it's like amazing to think that 25 years ago somebody said, there will be political utopia for hereafter.
Democracies everywhere.
Yeah, it's and how that it's like the Bernie Madoff of scholarship.
I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. You see the Berlin Wall going down. You see U.S. as the sole superpower.
Yeah, but I think
Persian Gulf. Everything's gravy.
So it's funny. Like one of the things I learned is that I did a PhD in international relations, which is like political science. And one of the things that I learned, I was a history undergrad, is that political scientists like to cherry pick history to support their kind of absurd theories at times. And this leads to a lot of things, a lot of problems, like they will greet us as liberators. That if we hold elections, they will come. That everybody wants to be a democracy, and if we just push it, then the world will be at peace because democracies don't fight wars against each other. Everything I've told you is real. That's actually, driven foreign policy, and people died for it, which is partly why I wrote this book. But so the original question of isn't China, isn't that good? Well, the problem we have is that Beijing we used to think it's impossible to have a centrally planned economy, but China seems to have done that. Companies in China work for Beijing and not the other way around. We don't have that here. And this current thing in Canada is an example of that. So I think that we have to think about, meanwhile, like Sri Lanka just lost a port, right? I mean, China,
Europe might be losing some.
Yeah, and Pakistan might as well. So we have to think that, so China has this thing called the three warfare strategy, which I really encourage you all to find. There's a lot of expertise. One of the problems that we have in Washington is a lot of expertise is self-created expertise, meaning like we have all these China experts right now, but they don't speak Mandarin. They've never been to China. And 2 years ago, they were ISIS experts. And then 2 years before that, they were doing something else. I mean, China has a strategy to push the U.S. out of the region. They have their own Monroe Doctrine. And it's called the three warfare strategy, which very few people in D.C. who are not true China scholars understand, you can get it online. The three warfares are this. One is economic warfare, one belt, one road. And they use their economic heft, the way maybe, say, a mafia don might. Another is influence. Think of Hollywood, think of CCTV, think of everything else that they do. And another is lawfare, twisting international law for their own ends. It's the perversion of rule of law, not the support of it. They do all three of these things. Now, what is conspicuously absent? Military. Their three warfares is not military. Oh, also, Russia is cutting its military budget, but they're not cutting their aggressiveness. One of the rules I discussed in this book is that the utility of force is declining in modern war. What that means is that it's the usefulness of force. And we in the West rank it high. We are all inheritors of Clausewitz, a very famous Prussian early 19th century theorist. And
he got some things right. War is an extension of politics.
He does, and nobody's arguing with that. But we put him on the altar of war, and we consider no other theorists. But there are other theorists like Sun Tzu in The Art of War, 500-ish BC in China. And my book is in the footsteps of Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu says, so for the acme of skill for Clausewitz is Napoleon. It's battlefield victory. The acme for Sun Tzu, that's stupid victory. He said the acme of skill for a leader is you win the war before the first shot is fired. You use deception and subversion. You trick the enemy and you outwit them. And that is what China is doing today.
In terms of China and Russia, if I'm the typical American reading the newspaper, I have to ask myself, why is everyone ganging up on the United States? Why don't they try to fight against each other? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that'd be a very U.S.-centric perspective, and I wouldn't bet on it. I would also say that, look, we can be in a competition with China that's not either all good or all bad. We have to lose our black and white blinders and look at the gray nuance, which is what the world, as we know, really is. And I think that part of it is that it's we are the reigning hegemon, and other powers want
heavyweight champion of the world.
Right, and China and Russia, they have different reasons. China wants to push us out of their region. They have this, Han Dynasty vision. We have the greater Tsar of Moscow right now, who has a vision for Europe. We have a greater Ottoman Sultan right now. We have, this is one of the concerns that we should all be concerned about is it also the rise of autocracy? around the world, and how should we think about that, and what should we do about it, especially since we are vulnerable to subversion being an open society.
In terms of how the U.S. military can brace itself for the era of unconventional warfare, what are some suggestions you have?
Well, first of all, we have this idea of conventional versus unconventional warfare. I would smash that. There's no such thing as conventional or unconventional. There's just warfare. It's a spectrum of armed conflict, and you can play along many different lines of it. Again, we used to do this during the Cold War. The second thing is to realize that war is not just about the military, and victory is no longer won on battlefields. Battlefield victory is almost obsolete now. I mean, when was the last time we had a battlefield victory?
73 Easting.
I would say.
I'm being
okay. USS Missouri. So, because we're gonna have. Thanks. We're looking USS Missouri in Japan. We're looking for a USS Missouri moment with ISIS, and we're frustrated we can't find it. That's because that's not how wars end. And did you know that 50% of all ceasefires fail now in 5 years? That's durable disorder for you. Half the world or more is experiencing some form of armed conflict. This is, wars don't end. They just perpetually smolder. That's the world we're living in. And the solution is not battlefield victory. The solution may not be military might. Victory and defeat will be fought in the information space. And that war is becoming more epistemological. And what that means is that, who can figure out truth from lies will determine winners and losers in an information age. So less military, more other things, and those other things may not come from the US government. They may come from private sector, from civil society, and we need to be more expansive as strategists in how to marshal our instruments of power than just looking at the federal government's organogram.
So today's weapons are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the media.
That's a big part of it. But I think we could look at China's 3 warfare strategy. It's very clever. We don't want to do all those things, but we should know what's being done, right? So I think influence, however you want to, whatever the tools are, but it's more than just online influence. There's all sorts of ways you can do strategic influence. And then there's dark arts as well. And one of the problems, here's the problem. See, we're investing in big weapons to fight open wars. Open war is not going to exist. It might happen here or there, but it's not conventional open wars. Look at what Russia did to get to Crimea. They could have blitzkrieg through, eastern Ukraine and seized Crimea, but they didn't. They were smart. They were fighting new ways of war. What they did is they used covert means. Spetsnaz special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, these fake militias. They used propaganda and influence, which is the true power of cyber, in my opinion. Is it's influence. It's not sabotage. They used all these things and little green men, and because as the West was bickering about what was going on, they seized the Crimea, and by the time they said, "Hey, it's ours," it was a fait accompli. That is the future of war. We live in a global information age where plausible deniability is more powerful than firepower. Think about that. The weapons we need are not firepower. They're things that influence the information space. And I'm not just talking about, and then how do you combat misinformation, campaigns of deception? Russia has this thing called masquerade or camouflage. It's a part of their way of war. We don't do it. We think it's kind of, unsportsmanlike. But, in World War II, there were traditional thinkers who thought the machine gun was unsportsmanlike too until their regiment got destroyed.
Would you compare what Putin has done with Crimea to what Hitler did with the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic?
Well, part of it. I think Estonia is worried right now, right? The Baltics, he's made this proclamation that anybody who has, Russian descent is now his responsibility to protect, which is a pretty frightening thing if you're in a foreign country and somebody's just laid claim to half of you. But that will be the test, because if the U.S. does not defend the Baltics under an Article 5 NATO agreement, that's the end of NATO. And that might be the end of the transatlantic alliance. But also, is the U.S. going to go to war, potential nuclear war with Russia for 5 million people? I don't know.
Do you think the United States hasn't been proactive in this area because of the fatigue involved with Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's a part of it, and I think that I'm very upset about the group of thinkers in Washington in like Bush 43's first administration who, said, "Oh, it's going to be easy, quick war, it'll pay for itself, be done in days and weeks at the most." That's what Rumsfeld said, and now we've spent everything, right? But part of it is I think we're just
and we used to before 9/11 have the confidence to say our strategy is to fight 2 wars at one time,
right?
East and West.
Right.
Now you will never hear that again.
No, you won't, and we couldn't.
We essentially
do it. Yeah,
we've squandered America's resources.
Right. We have, and our grandchildren will be still paying the bills, I think. But but part of it is also our strategic atrophy. I think is a bigger problem.
In terms of strategic atrophy, do you think the Trump administration has the strategic muscle it needs to plan 2, 5, 10 years out?
I have a hard time answering that since I'm a Department of Defense employee. But I will say that
neither the views expressed or written.
Right.
I read that at the end of the book.
As
Department
we
of
know,
Defense.
I do not represent the U.S. government.
And of course, don't put your job. At risk.
But I think we're so much. I mean, part of it we are embroiled in a domestic dispute that is being stirred up by our adversaries abroad, right? And you know that Putin and others must be rolling over laughing. I mean, put it this way: Putin fights the new ways of war. So this is an example of the old rules versus new rules. Russia has always wanted to disunite Europe, right? NATO, EU, that's always been their goal. And in the old rules of war, in the military rules, what they would do is that they'd send a message to NATO, usually in the form of munitions. They would have like a huge military exercise on the border of Germany, East and West Germany, 150,000 Soviet troops. And they'd say, NATO, it's just a military exercise, don't get uptight. And of course, NATO doesn't know if this is actually the real invasion or not. It was really disruptive. But now, when Moscow wants to disunite Europe, what it does is new rules of war. Remember, utility of force is declining, it's secrecy, war is getting sneakier. That's what's happening. They deliberately bomb civilian communities in Syria. And that creates a tidal wave of refugees that lands into the EU and creates the Brexit. And creates the rise of right-wing nationalist parties that want to break apart the EU, right? The old Soviet regime would have dreamed for such an outcome. That's the new ways of war. And it does it, we're asking ourselves, is it war or is it not? Well, that's part of the deception. That's what I'm trying to call attention to. It's like part of their strategy, since we look at war like a light bulb, it's either on or off, they try to keep our light switch to off so we remain docile and at, quote, peace. But all we're doing is, it's strategic atrophy. We're shooting ourselves in the proverbial foot.
It's now around 7:20. There's 10 more minutes of open questions, and then Dr. McFate will be available for questions after the program. In regards to some additional questions from the audience, some folks would like to learn more about the rules and how can we use the rules to apply it against autocracy. Okay,
so the rules, there's 10 rules, and I wish I could have I'll try to do this quickly to get to other questions. The first 4 are trying to break bad strategic habits. Rule 1 is conventional war is dead, so stop thinking about conventional war. 2 is technology will not save us. We always think that technology is the answer, but in the last 70 years of warfare, if there's one theme that's emerged is that Luddites defeat technically advanced militaries routinely. Right? Whether it's France and Algeria or Russia or the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, us in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, Luddites are beating us. So it's not technology. That's the definition of insanity. Third is that there's no such thing as war and peace. We've discussed that. The fourth is that hearts and minds don't matter. And what that means, they do matter at the strategic level. Look at China and Hollywood. But counterinsurgency, as we practiced it, is foolishness. It doesn't. The strategic logic behind COIN is you bribe the population. But populations are not bribable. That's why it failed. And then rules 5 through 10 are about how modern war is actually won. So one is mercenaries are returning. And that changes warfare when you privatize it. The next one is this will give rise to new powers that are not states, like Fortune 500 or random billionaires or narco lords or whatever. And states will become booty in war, not drivers of war. Look at narco states right now in Latin America. Another rule of war is that there will be private wars, wars without states, private warfare, like we saw in the Middle Ages. Then number 9 is that there will be shadow wars, and wars going underground, and we have to follow it. And we can discuss what a shadow war is. Think of the Cold War, but we are disadvantaged in an era of shadow war because secrets and democracy are not compatible. And lastly is victory is fungible. There are many ways to win. There are many ways to lose. This is how the weak defeat the strong, those who know this law. So that's a very brief overview.
It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And I don't typically say that about military books. Having been forced to read many military history books, many military theory books at West Point in the U.S. Army, I'd say it's refreshing in its assessment of the U.S. military's incredible flaws and what we need to do to fix it. And there's some great questions from the audience. One is, and this is a very meta question, and it goes to the themes of strategy. How do you define winning?
How do I find what?
Winning.
So that's an excellent question. So the last rule is called victory is fungible. Basically, victory means you have achieved your objectives that you set out for at the beginning of the war. Now, sometimes they legitimately change. But, often policymakers move the goalposts and say, we're winning. But history is never fooled by that. But you can also win by preventing your adversary from achieving their objectives, too. There's all sorts of ways that a cunning person can win modern war. And in the future, victory goes to the cunning and not the strong.
Another great question is, where would you reinvest the DoD's budget? You said you would cut it down. After you cut it down,
yes.
Secretary of Defense McFate, where would you do with the money?
I would do a couple. I would give it to the rest of the interagency for one. Like the State Department is dying. We need USAID. I would totally redo USAID because USAID is it's a bit of a dumpster fire, to be honest with you. Which we talk about. But there's a lot of places that we need to do a better job. But we have a lot of good interagency that need help. And also maybe like we have a new rules of war dividend. We give money back to taxpayers. I mean, think about $1.5 trillion on a plane that a dog doesn't hunt. So there's many things we could do with that money rather than sink it into these big programs.
So you sound a bit like President Trump, which is we should do nation building at home.
Well, Obama said that before Trump,
Yes, and Obama also said that we should get out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it seems like Trump is the one that's actually doing it.
Well, we'll see. He reversed course in August 2017. I talk about this in the book, like why you see people come in, promise these things, but once they're in the Oval Office, they suddenly become something like it all changes. And why is that? Good question.
It seems in Obama's defense, a Republican president can do certain things that a Democrat Republican can't do, and vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is the impact of the State Department budget reduction on our ability to influence and drive our narrative?
That's a great question. So the State Department does many things well, and they're being left to sort of die in the vine and have right now a big morale problem, as you can imagine. But they also need a new rules of war update as well. The State Department they need to think beyond Westphalia of interstate dialogue, but we are terrible at strategic communication. However, how can a country that created Hollywood and Madison Avenue be terrible at strategic communication?
And this quote this stat's used often, but we spend more on the Department of Defense's band programs
Yeah.
than we do on the State Department.
And I forget what Coca-Cola spends compared to what we spend. But I mean, I think we need to outsource it and not have bureaucrats drive it. And I discuss this in the book, like strategic messaging. What do we do? But I think the private sector is a place we can turn to.
This is a tough question. The U.S. seems to be divided as a country, clearly. How does our divisiveness affect our ability to defend ourselves in the case of an escalation into war with China or Russia?
Well, I think our adversaries are trying to divide us. That's their part of their strategy. And we have evidence of this. And it's not just Russia and China, it's a lot of other people too. So I think that's your answer. I think also, frankly, it's kind of controversial, but I think our foreign policy would benefit if we offered some sort of national service program for either military or civilian. Doesn't have to be military. But if people had skin in the game, that they had family that was going to have to go to Afghanistan or Iraq, they may not be so USA, USA. They might be a little bit more circumspect. And since we are a democracy, we need circumspect citizens.
I think history moves somewhat in cycles. I think the stuff you're saying today, tonight, and in the book, in 10 to 20 years will manifest itself. And potentially Assistant Secretary, Deputy Secretary of Defense, SecDef, etc.
Well, that would be great. I would love to see, obviously, this, but we will see. We've heard this all before. So,
we have a couple more minutes, so I'll finish with the questions from the audience, and then we'll open it up to the audience. President Trump recently suggested that the U.S. military technology is being outstripped by Russia and China. Is he right, and are we behind in development of new weapons?
So this is something that the defense industry likes to say a lot, and the answer is maybe, but let's consider the source, right? And what they're saying is like what their technology is like. Oh, they're building a new fighter plane, and like so we need more F-35s. So I think that we have to be savvy as consumers of information of this. So I do believe that there are certain technologies that matter. So war is going underground. It's becoming more epistemological. We need to have technology that tells us truth from fiction. I mean, if you see like clickbait and you knew it was made in North Korea, you probably wouldn't click it. That is more important to us than another sort of air missile or something like that. So I think that some of that stuff is a little shrill, and some of it is real. But differentiating, what is trill from real is the task that we have to make as voters.
It almost feels like if I take everything you're saying and collect it, distill it, we should perhaps nationalize Facebook, Twitter, and the social media.
Have like state-sponsored media? Like, no, I'm not. I'm not suggesting that. Although it could be state-sponsored soon by other states, so we should consider that.
That's all the time we have for this evening. I want to really commend Sean's book. We spoke before this talk this evening, and I mentioned there were some areas where I felt there could be some improvements. But as someone who has deployed to Iraq twice, who has lived and seen the inadequacies of the Department of Defense, and the lack of strategy in Bush II, Obama, and current administration, I think this book is extremely important. I think in 5 to 10, 15 years, as we hopefully are not in a situation where we're wondering, why are we in such dire strategic straits? People will point to this and say, well, China, Russia, they understood the new rules of war. So thank you, Sean, for writing the book. Thank you for being here this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs and Marine Memorial, I ask you in joining me in thanking Dr. McFate for this wonderful discussion. Many thanks to you all, the audience, for your terrific questions. Dr. McFate will be available to sign copies of his new book, The New Rules of War. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.